I wonder if, tell me if you can hear me. Let me see, let me do something. And please don't forget, record. Mm. Just relax. Relax. We have some time to still figure it out. Don't get overwhelmed. Meanwhile, let me clear here. Yeah, there you are. I see you. You see.
GSA special board meeting for Wednesday, November 4th. I believe our director Candace Minigan is not able to attend today. She is excused. Let's start with the Pledge of Allegiance. We'll open it up. I have a flag and a picture for you to do it. So if everyone, right hand over heart, ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America,
and to the republic for which
to the
it
republic for which it
one
stands,
nation,
one nation, under God, indivisible.
justice for all. Thank you. Always a good time to set the tone, especially after the national elections and everything that's been going on. Eva, can we get the roll call, please, for directors?
Sure. Director Holmgren,
I'm here.
Director Kimball, Chair Long,
Here.
Vice Chair McFadden,
Here.
Director Pace.
Here.
Thank you. And that's it.
Director Kimball is on. I don't know if you got him. So I think we have all directors except for Director Minigan.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. For those that are attending today, if you could put in the chat your name and who you're representing, if it's president or a special a nonprofit or so forth, that would help us. This tonight is being recorded, and so we'll be able to have that information for a sign-in, because usually we have that for our records. The next one is public comments. Do we have any public comments tonight? If you could raise your hand on the participant list, I'll look down and see if there's anything. Okay, I do have one hand, and that's with Kat Selim. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for taking my comment. I just want to say that I manage the Santa Clara River properties for the Nature Conservancy here in Ventura County. And I think that one goal should be preventing the wholesale loss of groundwater dependent ecosystems like we saw in the last drought in the Fillmore Piru area. As a manager of both the agricultural and the riparian forest properties here along the river, I'd like to see the sustainable management criteria balance the needs of both people and nature. The goal should be to ensure high enough groundwater levels for the necessary time to support the habitat. The last drought we saw, the levels dropped because pumping continued at high levels, and we've had massive die-off of our groundwater dependent ecosystems. The consultants should look at past groundwater levels that supported GDEs, what happened to cause the die-off, establish minimum thresholds to prevent recurrence, and set measurable objectives representing the desired state. MTs and MOs are required by SGMA, as we all know, as well as the considerations of groundwater dependent ecosystems as beneficial users. And there is some guidance framework that was developed in partnership with a couple of other entities that TNC has worked on that I'm sure that you're all aware of, but I'll still share in the chat if that's appropriate. And I just want to say thank you for allowing me to comment tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And yes, go ahead and share your information at the chat. Also, just to make sure everyone knows, all the meeting information and updates are at our Fillmore Piru Groundwater Sustainable Agency's website And that is on the agenda so that if you have any questions, you can always go there as well. I think it's the fpbgsa.org. So, okay, moving on, we have is our sustainable management criteria. And we have our consultant, Tony Morgan, who will be leading us on this item.
Evening, everyone. Let me do a screen share here and we'll get started. So you should be able to see opening screen there.
Yes.
Very good. All right. So good evening, Chair Long, directors, and everyone else joining us out there in Zoom land. We've got lots of topics to go through in about 2 hours this evening. To facilitate this process, might I suggest that we hold the deliberative kinds of questions until the end of the presentation, so we're sure we get through all of the material. Of course, if there are any clarifying questions along the way, we can pause and address those immediately. Chair, are you okay with that process?
Yes, I am, but I want to make sure that we do highlight the fact that we have a ad hoc committee for this item as well, and to address who's on it for those who have not been aware.
Okay.
If you can do that.
Ad hoc committee, would you like to weigh in?
Sure. Ed McFadden, I served on the ad hoc committee.
This is Glenn Pace. I served on the ad hoc committee as well, along with Candace Minigan. The three of us were on the ad hoc committee.
Very good. So with us tonight is Lisa Ballin, and she's going to be assisting with monitoring the chat box or raised hands so that we can be sure we get to all the questions that are brought up this evening. Patrick O'Connell, who works with us at DBSNA, is also here, and he's going to be presenting some of the aspects of the SMC work that we're going to offer tonight. So let's get the show on the road. I think there's probably some folks here who might be new, but just scanning through the names that I see on the participants list right there. So I thought we'd take a moment just to go through some of the highlights of things, just so everybody's on the same page with what we're talking about. So Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, commonly called SGMA. It's a state law that requires the management of high and medium priority groundwater basins to ensure their sustainability into the future. That's what we're all here to talk about this evening. So SGMA is generally grouped around 6 sustainability indicators, euphemistically called the 6 deadly sins of SGMA. And so it talks about lowering of groundwater levels, or surface water depletion, or degraded water quality, land subsidence, seawater intrusion, and reduction of storage. And so let's just look at the first one here: chronic lowering of groundwater levels, indicating a significant and unreasonable, SNU is my shorthand for significant and unreasonable depletion of supply. And so you'll hear these words, significant and unreasonable and undesirable results, coming up a lot in the discussion tonight. So it's a little bit cryptic when you wade into the world of SGMA and what do these phrases and terms mean. So quick review is probably appropriate. Significant and unreasonable, that's defined by the GSA. The GSA gets to establish what is a significant and unreasonable impact in the basin. It's your basic local control that Sacramento gave to each GSA, so they have some ability to control what's going on in their own local basin. A minimum threshold, that's a numeric value for each sustainability indicator. Remember the 6 indicators for each one of those, and it's used to define an undesirable result. It's a quantitative value that, if it's exceeded, may cause an undesirable result. And one of the key things we're hearing from DWR recently is that it cannot be an arbitrary number. You've got to have at least some technical justification behind why you're picking that particular value. And then a measurable objective. These are specific quantifiable goals. It says for maintenance or enhancement of specified groundwater conditions. So think of this as your sort of your desired future conditions. What would we like the basin to look like in the future? So this gets included in your plan, And this is the variable by which DWR is going to monitor your progress towards sustainability. So we pay attention to where we set the measurable objectives, the minimum thresholds, as we go through the establishment of the sustainable management criteria. So how did we get to where we are today to have this special board meeting? So we've had SMC, a Sustainable Management Criteria Ad Hoc Committee sessions. We've had several of those, bounced around ideas, tossed about concepts, approaches, things like that. There have been presentations to the board of directors at periodic board meetings. There have been stakeholder workshops on this topic. And so what we came to the conclusion is that it might be simpler for folks to get their head around the total universe of sustainable management criteria if they had all of them to look at once. And so not to have to focus on just subsidence or just groundwater levels and put them all together. So the technical consultant, we were tasked to craft a draft sustainable management criteria for the stakeholder and the board of directors considerations. So it's nothing final. It's a straw man. That's a perfectly acceptable way of thinking about it. So we went away for 3 weeks or so, came back and crafted this information that we're going to present to you this evening. Accompanied with that are some simple fact sheets for each one of the sustainable management indicators that provide some context and summarize some of the proposed language for the SMC. So included with the info packet for tonight's meeting are copies of the PowerPoint slides, as well as the draft SMC matrix, and then the simplified fact sheets that are 2, maybe 3 pages long, have some charts, some tables, a little bit of language in there that addresses some of the major questions that DWR has indicated that they think you ought to take into consideration while you're preparing your sustainable management criteria. So where does this fit in the grand scheme time-wise? We're right here doing our meeting this evening. United has just announced they've completed their model validation effort. And so they'll be ready very soon to start talking about the future conditions. We've received future conditions information from the city of Fillmore, County of Ventura, which covers the town of Piru and unincorporated areas, and with our remaining comments outstanding from the agricultural community. So that's just a polite nudge that we need to get this feedback soon. And if there's anything we can do to help facilitate that discussion, please don't hesitate to ask. Our immediate goals here is to shoot for a admin draft of the GSP in the February timeframe, so we can see that's not a whole lot of time between now and then. And so a lot of things are crunching along. Water budget, subsidence evaluations, the SMC that you're going to hear more about today. United's working on their groundwater model documentation, and that kind of thing. So a lot of things are going on behind the scenes that you don't necessarily see every day, but all of these are being pulled together with the idea of working towards an admin draft in the February timeframe. So time is short. The calendar's not necessarily our friend right now. So there's some special board meeting, this one in one, and maybe some others in the future that may be needed to help get some concepts and feedback and stakeholder engagement and board member input on a variety of things. So we'll talk about those in the future. What do we do with this SMC information? And so here's a flow chart that comes out of DWR's guidance documents. And it basically talks about each of your indicators here. And so here's groundwater level lowering is the first one here. And so you're supposed to review your historic data. That's all been going on. Look at the beneficial uses and users of groundwater in the area. Come up with some metrics for each one of the sustainability indicator. What's a metric? Metric just means the measurement method. How are you going to determine whether or not you're meeting your goals? Then you take a look at some representative sites around the basin and determine whether you're going to exceed those minimum thresholds. If the answer is no, you've got no undesirable results, keep on moving in the process. If the answer is yes, do you have a combination of minimum thresholds that would create some sort of locally defined, meaning GSA defined significant or unreasonable effect. This can be an individual if we have 80% of the water levels fail the MT test, and maybe that's enough all on its own. Or it could be something like when water levels go down, arsenic concentrations up. So we've got a combination of water level decline and water quality degradation. And when you put those two together, then we end up with an undesirable result. So there's lots of ways to go about looking at these things. And so we're going to show you our opinion on how to go about it here in just a few moments. So that's a really quick flying through things background. Are there any general questions that we should be addressing at this point in time? Don't see or hear
I don't see
anything.
any hand raised.
Okay. All right, then we're going to keep on moving. So we're going to talk about potential sustainable management criteria next. And in your packet that you saw is this draft sustainable management criteria matrix. And we're going to talk about these tonight. We're just going to slowly work our way through them and talk about them. The idea to orient you to this matrix is sustainable management indicators are down the left-hand column here. Possible language for undesirable results is in the next column. The metric or the measurement method that's being proposed is here in the third column. And then the last two columns cover the minimum threshold, the MT, or the measurable objective, the MO. And so we'll be talking about each one of these. And remember that there's a fact sheet associated with each one of the indicators that provides some background information, addresses some of the questions that DWR thinks you need to take into consideration when you're evaluating and establishing sustainable management criteria. And you've got those in the a board packet. The fact sheets aren't meant to be totally comprehensive documents. They're not the sum total of our knowledge on every item out there. They're meant to be just that, fact sheets, simple 2 to 3 page kind of information sets. Okay. So I thought we would start out with a quick discussion of representative monitoring sites. Remember, I mentioned that language when we were talking about comparing your MT to a certain set of wells out there. That's the representative monitoring sites. And I wanted to give you an idea of the number of active water supply wells and monitoring wells that are in these two basins. So if you're not familiar, this is Fillmore Basin here on the western side, and then Piru Basin here on the eastern side, and the boundaries like right in there, buried underneath that mass of dots right there. And so this diagram shows you where those wells are, the active supply wells and monitoring wells in the basin. And then the color coding in the circle gives you an idea of what aquifer zone those wells are producing water from. So you see here, there's a sort of a light blue and it's got an A. So that's out of aquifer zone A. Aquifer zone B is a solid green dot. Many wells are perforated across both zones or across multiple zones. And so if you see a green blue, that means an AB well, combination of both of those. If it's an ABC, well, then you get a little trifecta color there going, blue, orange, and green, and you get the idea. So there are several wells out there that we're not quite sure what aquifer zone. We're maybe missing data on the depth of those wells or the screen interval on the wells, and those are the black solid dots around the basin. So we're not going to necessarily winnow down to which representative wells there are, but I wanted you to get the idea. So what we've done in looking at all of the possible wells, which you saw on the previous slide, we've sort of leaned down the list a bit to those that have decent water level records associated with them. And so the number of wells falls off significantly. But what you see when you just look around at the colors is that we don't have a lot of data available for excuse me, not data, but wells available for monitoring the sea aquifer. So we've got one well over here, and then we've got some that are combos that are BC wells. That's the green orange colors there. So we're not going to pick which wells we're going to do tonight, but we just wanted you to say these are sort of the universe of wells to think about picking from. And we'll go through a discussion of how we winnow down this list further at a future meeting. Our goal is not to monitor every one of these wells. Our goal is to monitor representative wells. And so we can decide on how many that means in each well, but generally folks are doing something on the order of, oh, maybe 6, maybe 8 wells per basin as their representative set. Okay. So jumping into our first indicator, and I'm taking this in sort of what I think are the low-hanging fruit approach. So taking the ones that are easy to deal with first and then moving on from there. So seawater intrusion, it's one of those indicators that we're supposed to address. So in the real world, when you look at this, we are just too far inland. We're out here somewhere in this red rectangle. That's the Piru and Fillmore basins. And so we're a good distance from the coast. Hey, here's a map that was in the 2040 general plan materials showing where the area they think is going to be affected by seawater intrusion. And so we're quite a ways as the crow flies inland from that, but also we're over 300 feet above sea level here. So the western end of the Piru Basin is 300 feet, and the western end of Piru Basin is around 480 feet. So if we've got seawater intrusion that's getting up to 300 to 480 feet above sea level, I think groundwater sustainability plans are probably the least of our worries that we're going to be talking about. So seawater intrusion is not a realistic issue for these two basins, and so we will see how we write those up to put them as not applicable. You'll see that designation in the sustainability matrix. So we don't need to develop undesirable results, MTs or MOs for this. And this approach has been used by several other basins that are more inland and don't have seawater intrusion as a significant factor. So moving on to our second easier one to deal with is water quality degradation. We've discussed this indicator previously, and we believe that the GSA should be cautioned to not inadvertently assume responsibility for groundwater quality conditions that it doesn't have the regulatory authority to enforce. And so you can see some of the comments on here that we've tabulated for you. The DWR hasn't prepared any kind of guidance document for water quality. There are some third party out there, and you'll hear me talk about the Stanford group that did a document that I think is pretty applicable to this basin, the basins. Those regulations are generally focused on contaminated sites, not naturally occurring compounds. And so if we have boron or TDS or something like that in our basin, that's not necessarily due to any kind of contamination activity, it's more a naturally occurring compound, then it doesn't address those very well. Generally, a GSA does not have authority over water quality. That's reserved for the Regional Water Quality Control Board, the DTSC, the EPA, or in some cases, the aspects that can affect water quality related to land use, for example. None of those things have been provided to the GSA as an authority for them. Now, you're not responsible for enforcing water quality standards or collecting data to support existing water quality programs. However, I do think it's prudent for the agency to continue to participate with United and the counties when they do their standard routine monitoring across the basins. It's a fairly comprehensive monitoring effort. And so I think those monitoring programs provide us with information that allows us to keep tabs on the basin scale types of water quality changes, okay? So you're not required as the GSA to fix problems that occurred before January 2015 when the regs came into effect, okay? But you're also not supposed to be making the conditions worse, okay? So if you're preparing a plan and that plan has, oh, we're going to shift pumping, we're going to do this, and oh, by the way, I've got a Superfund site over here and I'm going to start pulling contaminants around because of the way I've structured my plan, then you are probably going to be pointed at, you, the GSA, are going to be pointed at as someone who has taken responsibility for making that situation worse. That's not the conditions we have here. So we're not looking at a position where this agency should jump in our opinion, to want to control water quality. You've got some pretty broad powers as a GSA. You know, there's broad language in there: perform any act necessary or proper to carry out the purposes of the SGMA. That's a pretty broad statement. However, the state did reserve regulatory authorities over water quality for itself and others like the feds in the EPA. So there are a couple of gray areas in water quality. It's not clear who's responsible to address any water quality problems that were present prior to January 2015 and have gotten worse. Okay, if they've gotten worse, who's responsible for that? If there's a regulatory agency that's already dealing with that, let's say there's contamination from an oil refinery, and that contamination has gotten worse, but it's under the purview of the state of California for their cleanup and monitoring programs. Well, that doesn't really fall to you. There's already an agency responsible for that. Okay, this is talking about something that is different than that. So if there's a water quality problem that's not being addressed by any other agency, are you the one that's supposed to step up? Our interpretation of it is that no, it's not you. It's your opportunity to raise your hand and get in front of the Regional Water Quality Control Board or whoever that appropriate regulatory agency is and bring the situation to their attention. So it's not necessarily, from our perspective, your role to jump up and say, yes, we wish to wade into that and be the regulatory agency of concern, because you really don't have jurisdiction over water quality. So when you put all that together, what does it mean as far as looking at MTs, MOs, and all that kind of thing? The draft SMC language we've got here in the slide is simple, it's straightforward, and it's modeled after language suggested by the Stanford's Water in the West program report on water quality requirements under SGMA. Our option A strawman for the MT states that the agency will consider water quality values included in existing or future regulations. We kept that language broad, simple. If we go in and list every single regulation, we might miss something, or there may be future regulations that go onto the books that we really want to include. And so we sort of took a different approach in B. We put in some of the major things: maximum contaminant levels for drinking water, health goals that are out there, and we just said other specific values that are of beneficial use to maybe to agriculture or industrial users and that kind of thing. So we're recommending a generic approach to this, something that leaves it open and allows you to function in a quite broad arena. The MOs for these are equally simple. You know, the option A says the authority to regulate water quality is afforded to the state and federal agencies rather than our GSA. You're not a purveyor. You don't have water quality authority. You're not responsible for compliance, but you will cooperate with appropriately empowered entities. This says you have the ability then to raise your hand and call on the regional board, or maybe even the LA Sanitation District or something like that, because we don't, or any sanitation district, because we don't agree with the water quality we're seeing in their effluent. You have that under your MT that says, you know, monitoring with water quality values included in existing and future regulations, but you also aren't the one responsible for that. So we've got a couple of different approaches. One is much more generic, one is a little bit more specific, but they both have the same basic flavor associated with them. So groundwater levels. This indicator is of interest to many stakeholders, and one that we've wrestled with to create criteria that are consistent with the hydrology, stakeholder interests, and can be implemented with the readily available data that we have. As a refresher, this map shows how water levels declined during the 2011-2016 drought in those wells included in the current water level monitoring program. And so we see red and orange colors generally in the Piru Basin, and those gray to sort of orange or whatever those other colors are over here, tan, I guess, and yellow colors in the Western Fillmore Basin. So it's telling us that water levels declined more during the drought in the Piru Basin than they did generally in the Fillmore Basin. And that's been recognized for quite a long time. So we've seen this diagram. This gives us a little bit of flavor of the kinds of impacts we expect when we see droughts. So what are we looking at here as far as a possible SMC language? There's several ways to approach this. Okay, and we took two different ways. You'll see here under the undesirable results category. We're cognizant of the general guidance that we got from some directors to push the system, that maybe set the MT lower than we might otherwise. We also wanted to rely on the existing data that we have on hand. We don't have the time to create a lot of new data and get it included into this document. We can certainly consider that for future editions of the GSP, but not for this one. Taking these into account, we've included these options A and B for this indicator. We set for option A, static groundwater levels declined below the top of the screen. That's the undesirable result we're trying to avoid. We don't want groundwater levels to drop below the top of the well screen. And why is that a logical value? From an operational standpoint in a well, you get the potential for increased wear and tear on your equipment. You have the opportunity for cavitation, which is hard on your equipment. You generally run a risk of more sand production in your wells, which is damaging to the downhole pumping equipment and some of your above ground equipment as well. So we think if this is the approach we want to take, that we've got a specific reason that we can cite to DWR that this is why we wanted to do that. And in option B, we go even more aggressive with it and say, this is where groundwater levels decline below the bottom of the well screen. And we're not looking at this one in too much detail this evening. We think that the option A approach is the one that makes sense. It's aggressive, but it's not overly aggressive. So the MT for option A would be water levels equal to the top of the well screen. And then the MO is set at water levels at or near the 2011 water levels. That's a time when the basins, plural, were full or largely full. And that represents a nice measurable objective that has beneficial uses for more than one purpose. Here's another map showing a lot of dots that represent water wells in this basin. And so this is the legend for this map is a bit busy, but it's trying to show you what aquifer zone was tapped by a particular well. So you'll see the A's, the ABs, B's, BCs, etc. here, but it also gives you a designation of whether it's an agricultural, domestic, industrial, or a municipal well. And so the earlier map we showed you of water levels and of water level declines and wells in the basins from which we have a current monitoring program don't cover all of the active wells in the basin. So what we got was an export from United for all of the active supply wells and monitoring wells used in the groundwater model. Where are all of those? And we got hydrographs for each of those wells showing the simulated water conditions over time for each of those points. And our purpose here was to try to broaden the number of wells that we wanted to look at in the basin for setting an MT for groundwater level. we don't want to look just at a half a dozen wells. We want to know, yeah, if we set this MT at X level, is that going to affect 10 of the active pumpers out there, or is it going to affect 150 of the active pumpers out there? And so that was the purpose for going down this path and getting a lot more information from there. So this shows data from 1985 to 2015 was what we got from United. And at this point, I'm going to stop here for a moment and let Patrick O'Connell take over. And he's worked on processing these data, and he's going to take us through the next few slides here. So let me stop sharing and let Patrick jump in.
Yeah. Thanks, Tony.
Sure.
Try sharing my screen here. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yes.
Awesome. All right, so yeah, as Tony showed, we looked at all the wells in the model to help look at as many wells as we could and use a consistent time frame to look at how often water levels have dropped below the top of screen at each of these wells. And when we did this evaluation, we noticed that wells kind of generally fell in 3 categories. And the well that we're looking at here in the Piru Basin is an agricultural well screened in the B aquifer zone. And this is an example of a well where the water levels, which are shown here in the teal dots, which are measured water levels, as well as the model results between 1985 and 2015 in black. We noticed that this is an example of a well where the water levels are always above the well screen. And so what we're doing here is showing how over time, water levels have fluctuated generally between about 500, 550 feet elevation. And what we're plotting along with that are the proposed MO shown here in blue and the proposed MT, which is top of screen down here. And we set the MO at the water level that was at average 2011 condition shown right here, which is right before the most recent drought, which I'm sure many people remember. So we just threw out there, this is an ideal condition. We've seen in the past that droughts started off at this level. So we thought the basin might want to shoot for this kind of groundwater level as much as possible. So what we did is we just kind of did some statistics. We have a histogram here showing how often the water level is generally in a certain range. And then we move over here and got a distribution of all the water levels, which allowed us to get a probability for each well that the water level is either below the MO or the MT or both. So in this instance, the MT is not really an issue because it is so deep. So you don't see the probability of the minimum threshold being violated here, but you see that about 75% of the time, water levels were below, I guess you call them the full basin conditions. And, ideally you'd want to always be there, but if you kind of think of like baseball, this is about like 3 out of 10 times you're at ideal conditions, which is a good situation. So this is one example of many wells which have water levels high above the well screen.
Patrick, just to interrupt with a clarifying question. There was a question to again state what MO and MT is. MO
Sure.
being measurable objective and minimum threshold.
Oh yeah. Right. Thank you, Lisa. MO is a measurable objective. It's kind of ideally where you want your basin to be. Anticipating a future drought, you would like to have some reserves in the groundwater basin to have enough water in the ground as it declines to keep pumping or satisfy other needs like ecosystems and SMCs such as that. The MT is the minimum threshold, as Tony mentioned. We chose this based on, typically you don't want your water levels below the well screen because it can increase maintenance costs. Yeah. Trying to advance my slide. Okay. So here's another category. These are water levels at a well in Fillmore. This is actually a domestic well, also screened in the intermediate B aquifer. Here, it's kind of a different story where water levels are generally above the well screen, as you can see with the red line and the blue dots. but at times they do technically dip below the well screen. So when we do our statistics at this well, we see that about 6% of the time, based on the results we have between 1985 and 2015, the MT was not met. Whether that's significant or not is to be determined, but under this scenario, it's just another category of wells like that. Again, water levels were about 70% of the time below your MO, but you were still meeting your MO about 30% of the time. We'll show one more example of a well. Here is an agricultural well in Piru where screens actually set 5 feet below ground surface. So in this situation, water levels are actually always below the well screen. So in this situation, technically your MT is violated about 97% of the time. So we acknowledge that some wells don't always meet the ideal conditions. So I'm just going to move forward and show the results of looking at all these wells. And what you see is the red dots are those where the MT is constantly being violated, including that last well we just looked at. But you can see overall, most of the wells never have an issue with the water levels dropping below the top of screen. And of course, there's shown in these distributions here for each basin. This is for Piru and this is for Fillmore. There are always some wells that will violate it some percent of the time. But acknowledging that some wells, especially these that are red, some wells just aren't well suited to meet this criteria. They were intentionally designed with a shallow well screen. We went ahead and just removed them. And these were generally wells that were either monitoring wells. Monitoring wells don't pump water or produce water, so they don't necessarily provide a beneficial use, especially for using water. But so we removed about 20 or so, maybe more, monitoring wells. And we also removed those wells, the very shallow well screens. We removed some wells where the calibration was a little less robust, so we didn't want to. We're just kind of putting all those off to the side to be looked at, reevaluated. And just as a finishing remark, for this SMC, the groundwater levels, you don't want to see a chronic decline over time. And if I just go back really quickly to the graphs, you can see that the water levels historically have always kind of rebounded back to where they began. So as of yet, we don't really see a significant concern for water level decline. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Tony.
All right, thanks.
And Tony, I don't know if you want to address this one question in the chat. I think it's more of a clarifying question than a comment, but it says, why are we talking about water levels in relationship to the screen when it really comes down to depth of static water level?
And that's basically, when we're talking about water levels in this context, we are meaning static water levels. So that's one and the same thing. And so I think we're okay. I think we're talking the same thing unless there's a refinement to that question. Whoever asked that question, is there a refinement to that you want?
This is Kelly Long. I do have a question on that.
Yeah.
So I could put in a well that, and you're going to have to help me because I'm not as educated on reasons of why the screens are placed in a certain area. Does it have to be in the screen have to be in a certain area, or can the well be deeper? And so why exactly are we using the screen level only? I just don't want to be restricted if needed.
No, I don't think it's being restrictive. The screen is a criteria we developed because of the operational complexities that it makes for the well owner. If the water levels fall below the top of the screen and the well pump is already down in the screen, then we're increasing a situation where there's an increased opportunity for cavitation in the well. There's generally an increased opportunity for the production of excessive sand and silts that damage the pumping equipment in general. So we're using that as our reason. So that same concept of operational complexities applies whether or not the screen is shallow or whether it's deep. So it's something that's applicable to any well at any depth.
Okay,
So-
and my other question is you say that we're violating if we go below that area, and if the water depth is there but it's not substantially harming anything, I'm just trying to understand
Yeah, so we've exceeded.
why would we use that?
Yeah, and so maybe violated is too strong of a word, but if we've exceeded the MT in a situation, then that doesn't mean that your well cannot pump water. There's lots of wells out there where, and he showed an example of one where the water table is below the well screen. There are some wells that were designed and built specifically that way, where the well screen is really shallow, and so the water table is below that well screen virtually all the time. So that's just a situation that we're going to put those wells in a particular category. They're still pumping. You know, we didn't hear any anecdotal information during the last drought that there was a problem with folks who had to lower their pumps and the water levels fell down at the screen or into the well screen a bit. We didn't hear that anybody said, no, I can't pump anymore. So these wells still function, even though the water levels fall. They may not be as efficient. They may have a little more operational concern associated with them. But I still think that the water level at the top of the screen is a reasonable way to think about it. And it's up to the stakeholders to give us some input, and the board, obviously, to give us some input as to whether that makes sense as you view the world.
Thank you.
Surely.
Tony, I've got my hand raised too, if you've got a minute.
Yes.
We've had discussions about using screen levels, and I'm still concerned about that, just because if I look at the screen levels of the wells that I'm familiar with, the tops of the screen levels vary wildly. There's close to a 400-foot difference.
Yep.
And I think that's a pretty arbitrary number to try to define. You've shown us 3 wells, which were very interesting, very useful. But I hope we can find a better way to define that. I think we're going to have to look at groundwater depth rather than screens, but that's a continuing discussion, I think.
Yeah, and I hear you. And some of the thoughts that we haven't delved into too much tonight is that for wells that are in the BC aquifer zone, for example, they may be deeper. And so their MTs are going to be deeper. If it's a shallow well, it's in the A zone. Well, maybe those MTs are shallower. So we're trying to be able to say we're addressing those people who have shallow wells, and we're also addressing those people who have deep wells. Can the MT level be different in each well? Sure can. Sure can. Are we going to set MTs for representative wells that we're going to use to establish, or rather monitor, the health of the basin? Yeah, we're going to do that. We're going to do that. So there's a time when we could say that as the water levels fall, some of the shallow wells will exceed their MTs before the deeper wells will exceed their MTs. And that's the kind of thing that I think the board wants to hear about, is that, well, how many wells are experiencing that condition? Is it 2% or is it 25% of the wells? And so that helps you make the decision on whether or not that's a significant and unreasonable effect. I don't think we want to be in a situation where we say if one well anywhere in the basin violates or exceeds the MT, that the whole basin is now under that same cloud. I don't think that's the purpose of Sigma. I don't think that was their intent. So we're using representative wells to monitor what's going on in the basin. And if we go to a situation where we talk about groundwater level changes, then we still have that situation. If the level changes enough that domestic wells suddenly become dry, well, that's an issue. That's an issue. but that same water level decline may not affect a agricultural irrigation well. So what we tried to do is look at it from the perspective of the individual well owner and operator, and take into consideration for this how the plan and the MTs that are established in there might affect the individual operators.
A question about the zones A, B, and C. I've had discussions before where it was my understanding that in most parts of the basin, those zones, there's water movement between those zones, except maybe in a few areas that have thicker clay layers. Is that true for the majority of the basins?
Yeah, there's the aquatards that separate the aquifers are not, completely impervious. There is leakage between them.
So it's
That is
a
true.
completely different situation than, say, on the Oxnard Plain, where there is a very impermeable layer between different parts of the upper and the lower basins.
Yeah, the upper and lower systems there are much more isolated than what we probably are going to be seeing in these basins. United's model has that in there, leakage factors for the various units. So that's a value that helps them in the model distribute water up and down. So if it needs to go up a layer or down a layer, the model takes that into consideration.
For most of the well drilling logs that I'm familiar with, which is a tiny portion of the basins, it's mostly a change between different sizes of gravel, sands, and cobbles. So it's a pretty big sandbox from what I've seen.
Yeah, I think that characterization is highly applicable in the Piru Basin. There are more clays and things present in Western Fillmore Basin. So roughly, Sespe confluence with Santa Clara River west. There's more clays there. I've looked at a lot of well logs in that part of the world, and there's more clays there than there are in Piru Basin. So, the general descriptor we use for Piru is it's a big sandbox. That's pretty applicable. That's pretty applicable.
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
Of course.
Tony, did you want to, it seems like we're kind of going into the kind of comments. Do you want to continue with that or get through the rest of your presentation and then come back?
Let me answer these two questions I see here in chat real quick, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, that's what I was referring
Okay.
to.
Yeah, there's a question there about GSP regulations, identify groundwater elevations that indicate significant unreasonable depletion of supply. Operational issues, not necessarily depletion of supply. Yeah, I agree with that in concept, but it's also a function of if they're not able to use their well, then it is a reduction in supply for them. If the well is going to operate less efficiency because the water levels have dropped well into the screen interval, then that's an operational issue, but also has the ability to deplete supply from that particular well. The next one there is some wells have multiple screens at different well depths, and doesn't necessarily mean your well is necessarily impaired. That is true. I won't say many, but there are several wells out there that have multiple screens. And what we're looking at is the top of the shallowest screen. And so when it says your well isn't necessarily impaired if it drops below the top of the screen, I will generically agree with that. But anytime you do that, and if your pump is set above that top of screen, then obviously that's going to be an effect for you to consider. So having multiple screens in your well is not something that's going to be necessarily detrimental to how you operate when your water levels are declining. You keep moving your pump down and you've got additional well perforations deeper in the well in other intervals. And so that allows you to keep water supplied to your pump. So again, if it falls below that top of the screen, then that's a situation where you're no longer getting the water from that top of the screen interval, and you're getting your well from a lesser feet of screen in the well. Okay, let me jump back into the world of groundwater storage for a moment. So there's lots of interesting information in the data that Patrick just distributed to you, and he was being bashful and didn't really say that, you know, he did that for 300 and some wells. He did that statistical evaluation. So there's a lot of information that's buried in those tables that he has. Let's talk about storage for a moment. One of the comments we've heard previously is that there's a desire to have an adequate groundwater reserve to last through a typical drought without the need to limit groundwater extractions. And so we need to define what adequate groundwater reserves look like. And for these GSPs, we're proposing to use a water level decline experienced in the 2011-2016 drought. That's a 5-year drought. It was pretty severe. And we're going to call that the typical drought. So really, how much water was extracted during that typical drought? And so in the Fillmore Basin, there was 46,800 acre feet per year on average during the drought period extracted. That's not a whole lot different than what the long-term average is for that basin. The Piru Basin extracted about 12,000 acre feet. That's rounded off 1,000 acre feet on average more during the drought period than not. So there's not a lot of evidence that there's massive increases in pumping during the last drought period. So our concept here for storage is to set the MT at the top of the well screen, identical to the MT for groundwater level. And the MO we use as the amount of groundwater decline added to the top of the well screen. So for example, if water levels fell 50 feet in the 2011-2016 drought, and the top of your well screen is at 100, your MO is going to be at 50 feet. So we add that decline back onto the well screen depth. So the MO, that's your manageable objective. That's where you want to be. So with water levels at that level, we've got a 5-year reserve of groundwater before we reach the MT. So that's the general concept for that. It's pretty straightforward. If the board or stakeholders feel that we would like to have a more aggressive MO for that, you could easily say, well, we're going to plan for not a 5-year drought, but we're going to plan for maybe a 7-year drought. And we can scale those numbers up accordingly and establish an MO that's a little bit shallower than it would otherwise be. So this is not really a rocket science kind of indicator as far as I'm concerned. There's the advantage we have is that we have a lot of data and we can be able to quantify how much water levels are affected during drought periods. So I'm going to jump quickly to subsidence, watching the clock here a little bit. It's an interesting indicator. A recent draft EIR for the 2040 general plan included a map that showed all the alluvial basins here that are in this blue tint have subsidence due to groundwater extractions. And that's, unfortunately, that's not really the case. Okay, and I think this diagram was prepared as with a misinterpretation of what the information was in a USGS report. That report didn't indicate that there was subsidence everywhere in this big basin, but really only indicated that it was in the Oxnard Plain area primarily. And so the information was kind of construed and skewed to show that it was for every place. So that's not really the case. There's no data or report to substantiate that that's what's going on there. So we've seen these graphics at a previous meeting. And so our concept here is to have a bit of a dual phase evaluation of subsidence in the basins. So we're going to use satellite data That's the INSAR information you see here. And we've talked about this before. There's satellites that go overhead and they look at the difference by bouncing beams off of the radar beams off of the ground surface, and they can tell how much the ground surface has moved. Okay. And we saw an example for Fillmore and Piru basins where we took that INSAR data and interestingly enough showed how we are having some elastic rebound in the Piru basin that's probably I went back and looked at it, temporally tied to the same time United was spreading a bunch of water in the Piru Basin. So that means there's some elastic subsidence going on there as well. This is good data for ongoing monitoring. It doesn't really help us in looking at potential subsidence for future groundwater conditions. And for that, we're proposing a slightly different approach. So at past workshops, you've heard us talk about the potential subsidence screening tool that was prepared for the Texas Water Development Board. This is a spreadsheet model that uses the geomechanical attributes of geologic materials and information such as thickness of the clays, which are that component that are going to subside if appropriate, and the anticipated water level decline in the future. So those two big things are attributes that this technique is particularly sensitive to. And so when we look at it in a little bit more detail, we can see what happens when the amount of clay goes up. So I did an analysis for 75 feet of clay, 100 feet and 150 feet of clay, and then some water level declines over the historic low. And so I did 20, 30, 40, 50. And as you can see, as the amount of water level decline goes up, the amount of predicted subsidence goes up as well. And so what we have here is a bar that shows the top end of the bar showing the maximum estimated subsidence, the bottom end of the bar representing the minimum estimated subsidence. And then we've heard comments at previous meetings that there was thoughts that this screening tool overestimated the amount of subsidence that could occur in the basin. And so we took that to heart and did a little bit of a weighting approach to that and weighted these values and put 60% of the weight on the lower end and 40% on the upper end of this estimated subsidence value, and then came up with what we thought is maybe it's a most likely or more likely level of subsidence. So the key takeaway here is that the amount of clay that you have there is really a big driver. Water level declines below the historic low are what triggers subsidence. And so I just did 20 through 50 foot for these examples. So if we look at the information a little more, we can say, even if we went to the most pessimistic situation and said, let's key things to 150 feet of clay thickness out there, and we say 1 foot of subsidence is our target. We don't want any more than that. We're looking that we can have 20, maybe even 30 feet of subsidence, or excuse me, of water level decline below the historic low before we're in danger of getting to an estimated 1 foot of subsidence. If the clay thicknesses are smaller, then you can see there's a lot bigger range of water level declines that will keep you beneath that 1 foot of estimated subsidence. So we're looking at going forward for the straw man that we're presenting tonight and saying that because we don't have this clay thickness information for every single well in the basin. We just don't have e-logs. The driller's logs are certainly not sufficiently detailed to do this kind of analysis from. And so if we use a little bit of a pessimistic approach and say, we're going to assume that the clay thickness is 150 feet everywhere that we're concerned about, then we're talking about we could have another 20 foot of decline of the historic water level before we get to our 1 foot target there. So if we look at this broad scale, we can come up with this kind of of approach. We need to define what is the historic low. In the past, we had talked about using the 2016 low, water level low, as our historic low, but Patrick did an evaluation and looked at a lot of hydrographs that have longer records that go back into the 30s and 40s, for example. And when we take a look at the low water levels from those older periods of time and compare those to the 2016 low level, we get a situation where most of the older historic lows are around 20 feet below the 2016 level, on the order of 20 feet. So if we're going to come up with a technically defensible subsidence MT here, we could use something like the 2016 water level low. That's a starting point. We're going to adjust that to account for the historic water levels. So minus 20 feet off of that. And if we assume that 1 foot is our allowable subsidence, and we'll get into that explanation of that undesirable result language in just a moment. If we assume that that's 1 foot of allowable subsidence, and we're, again, using the most pessimistic, we're going to go with the higher clay amounts there. Our MT ends up being the 2016 low minus 40 feet, the 20 and 20, giving you minus 40 feet. So that's the kind of approach that we've looked at here. If we put that into language for proposed SMC matrix here, we've got undesirable result language that says land subsidence amounts that interfere with critical infrastructure operations that are greater than 1 foot of subsidence in a single year or 1 foot of cumulative net subsidence over 5 years. And so we put this second phrase in there, 1 foot of cumulative net subsidence over 5 years, to take into consideration the situation where it's kind of a creeping variable. So you could say, oh, in year 1, we only had a 1/2 foot of subsidence, so we're good, no problem. But in year 2, we have another, in year 3, we have another 1/2 foot. And so suddenly in 5 years, we've got 2.5 feet of subsidence. And so at that point, then that may not be a point where we want to think that that's a negligible effect, and that starts to fall in the category of significant unreasonable. So it's that kind of creep number there that I was concerned about, and so wanted to put this additional language in there that says 1 foot of cumulative net subsidence over 5 years. How are we going to get that information? Well, we're going to use the INSAR data. That's going to give us our recent historical, probably a year in arrears of it by the time the data are collected and DWR gets it processed and it gets passed out to the public for use. And then as we go forward into the future and do our future conditions modeling, then we're going to use the screening tool to help us with that. So the MT for this is 20 feet below the historic low water level, and the MO is set at the historic water level. So an MO at the historic water level is at a point where the water level has not declined below historic conditions, and so the potential for subsidence is virtually eliminated at that point in time. So how does that distribution go across the basins? We took a look at it. Here's, if we went 20 feet lower than the 2016 water, we can see these are the kinds of depths to water that we need to worry about. We got some deep guys over here in the more western end of Fillmore Basin. We've got lots of yellows and greens, and then we drop into the blue-green kind of category here. So it's certainly within the realm of having the data to capture this and to monitor this type of decline in water level. So I think we've come up with a program here that gives you both satellite data to monitor in arrears and the screening tool to give you a future potential look. So I'm watching the clock.
Tony, we do have Dr. McFadden has a question.
Yes, please.
Tony, I'll try to add, not to waste time, but it seems like the generally the water levels that we see in the basin, if you're measuring from the surface, range between, let's say, next to the river, 20, 25 feet to maybe, I don't know, 150, 160 feet. And the range that the water levels fell during the drought were between, let's say, 50 and 100 feet.
Mm-hmm.
So isn't it true that the clay layers that you're really worried about as contracting as they dry would only be in that zone, not below or above where the water table usually sits? So
Those clays that have already experienced a historic water level decline theoretically have already done their compaction. If they were going to do it, they've already done it. So that's why we set our value at lower than the historic low. Once we go below the historic low, then there's an opportunity for other clays to compact.
the total zone of concern is under 100 feet thick, or let's say 50 to 100 feet thick. And so I think the percentage of clay layers in any part of the aquifer would be nowhere near, say, the 75 feet of clay or 100 foot of clay that some of the numbers were based on. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that number of 75 or 100 feet of clay includes those fine grained materials that are within the aquifer. I mean, we always think of the aquifer as being sand and gravel, but that in reality, when you look at e-logs and things like that, there are fine grained stringers in there. And so those are our potential stringers of clays that are susceptible to subsidence. And you're also talking about those clays that border that aquifer. So as you depressurize the aquifer is a better phrase, then you induce flow from the adjacent aquatards, and that gives you the opportunity for subsidence from the adjacent clays as well. So the aquatards above that is the ones I'm primarily concerned about.
Are there adjacent clays in our basins that we need to be concerned about?
In some wells, yes, for sure. For sure.
Okay, it just seems to me that I'll have to have a discussion with you and educate myself more, but on the surface, it seems like the clay layers that we're concerned about may not be anywhere near as thick as what we're talking about.
That's possible. And
the areas of concern, just the areas where the water is rising and falling in the aquifers.
Right. And so we're trying to get tonight a feel for whether there's buy-in to the concepts that we're rolling out here, and do stakeholders buy into that? Does the board buy into it? Are there other ideas that you would like for us to consider? So that's really it. And then we'll go back in and do a detailed evaluation. If we get a thumbs up on how we're doing subsidence, then we'll go back and do a detailed evaluation of that as we move forward.
Okay, thanks for the explanation.
Of course. Of course. So
Tony, do you want to, there's a comment and question in the chat. Do you want to circle back to that later or hit them now?
Let me see what we got right there. Okay, I see a comment here from Dan on the 2012, 2016 being a better period for the 5-year drought. That's fine. I understand what that's about. Maximum cumulative depth of clay. We just talked about that, Ed. Piru Basin has most stress suggested during the drought. It's not noticeable or serious. I agree. We don't want to overestimate the subsidence impact. If we had the ability and the time to go through every single well out there, we could make a far more detailed estimation of what the subsidence looks like. And I think if you looked at those graphs that had the lower amount of clay, you saw that even when there was 75 or 50 feet of clay, that even when there was water level drops of 50 feet, that the potential for subsidence, at least in our weighted number there, was pretty low, Basis for concluding 1 foot of subsidence result in significant undesirable effects. Part of that is looking at what GSPs have done in other regions. People who have Lots of subsidence issues in the Central Valley have generally trended towards 1 foot as something that would be significant for, displacement along the Friant Canal as an example. And so using that as a bit of a yardstick, then it can be 2 feet, but we really don't have any data to say, how is this going to affect all of the critical infrastructure? There are gas pipelines that cross the basins. That's in the fact sheet. There's distribution lines within the city that are gravity fed, not distributions, but recovery lines for sewage and things like that. We don't have the ability to go through a detailed evaluation of that at this level for this GSP. So we think one foot is a reasonable number. It's something that we don't feel is going to cause a significant amount of effect out in agricultural land, for example. It may be more of an issue within the cities, but we don't really have any hard and fast information for that. We did rely heavily on what other GSPs had proposed would be significant for their linear water conveyance features, and 1 foot seems to be a reasonable number. How we know from if we're observing elastic or inelastic subsidence, I think it's gonna be a look at what's going on with the distribution of United's release from Lake Piru, or things coming down the river from Castaic, or just natural infiltration from storm events. We're going to be able to look at that. And as we know, the INSAR data has a temporal component to it, so we can look at what's going on sort of a month-to-month basis and figure out whether we think that's elastic or inelastic subsidence. If we see it recovering during wet periods, then that's going to lead us to conclude that that's probably elastic. Okay, let's jump in here to depletion of interconnected surface waters. And you've probably noticed that on the matrix, there are a couple of question marks for the surface water depletion line there. Sigma's asking the GSA to determine what degree of groundwater extractions impact surface flows. These data are not readily available, and several GSAs have attempted to use surrogate data, for example, impacts to GDEs, as a way to semi-quantitatively get at surface water depletion. So United Water Conservation District staff and the technical team here huddled up to brainstorm on a more quantitative way to try to address this. And we were heavily constrained by what data do we actually have. And so we think we've come up with a way to tackle this. And so let's walk through that for a moment. So United has, for a few wells in the basin, developed relationships between groundwater elevations in a well and surface water flow. This is in CFS here, surface water flow. So there's a relationship between those. And so if we know what the groundwater elevation is in the well, we can then use this relationship to estimate what the surface water flow value might be. Okay. Taking this a step farther, if we actually had a historical hydrograph for this, and this one goes back to 1950, and this hydrograph does not necessarily go to this well right here. I just picked this one because it had the appropriate groundwater elevation ranges on it. So if we had a long range hydrograph here, we can use that to say, gee, in this low period, in this drought period, how much flow was there at this location? So we use this relationship to say, well, the groundwater elevation was 480 feet. That translates into zero flow. Not surprising. We're in the height of a drought period right there. Secondarily, we could say historically, what was going on during this period when the basin was relatively full. We could say, oh, well, then we can come down here and across. And so CFS flow looks about 12 CFS. And so we're looking at this approach to try to refine how we can do actual estimates of groundwater impacts to surface water flows. So what United is going to do to help us with that is they're going to run a modeling scenario where we turn off the groundwater pumping. We set it to 0 for those wells near the river. So basically one grid side, either side of the river. And we set it to 0 for those wells that are pumping from aquifer zones A and B, the shallower zones. Okay. And when we look at the impact of 0 pumping and current pumping, we can then get the ability to at least semi-quantify the pumping. So, excuse me, the changes in surface water flow. So if we have a situation where we said the groundwater elevation is 530 feet in our key well with pumping, so we can see that relationship, but without pumping, that value is 25. So we get a scenario where we can say 25 minus 12 means that the estimated pumping impact is 13 CFS. So we haven't done this before. United's going to work on the modeling, and hopefully sometime in the next couple of weeks, we'll have that information and we can start processing and churning on it. Now, what this means is that, so there's been 13 CFS of impact in my totally made up cartoon example here. We still, as an agency, have to decide, is that significant and unreasonable or not? Is it an impact to GDEs? Well, it still says there's surface water flow there. There's rising groundwater in these areas near the basin boundaries. There's still rising groundwater even when there's pumping. So is this amount of pumping significant? And we'll have to wrestle with what that means. And so you saw on the matrix that there were the question marks there that we have to ponder how we're going to establish these types of significant and unreasonable criteria. So for the matrix, we're a little blank here because we've got the question marks, but we're going to use the groundwater model and the relationships that United has developed for key wells in the basin to try to address this flow. So we're talking about, for an undesirable result, surface water flows that are depleted by groundwater extractions or your GSA's project and management actions that impairs the beneficial use of the water. That's the undesirable result. The agency is responsible for groundwater depleted by groundwater extractions or any projects or actions that the agency may take as a part of its plan, for example, that impairs the beneficial use of the resource. So we're going to need to wait on the data from United, as I said before, and we're hoping to get that information from them in the next couple of weeks, and then we can move forward with processing that and come back to you at a future meeting with a little more refined process and a little more information on what the data actually is telling us. So I thought we'd take just a moment and look at those indicators all in one place. Okay, the MTs and MOs are superimposed on this hypothetical well. I stretched the well out, so I made it 300 feet deep, and I put 100 feet of well screen at the bottom here. And so here's where the MTs and MOs are plotted for groundwater levels and for storage and subsidence. And so what we've proposed in the matrix at this point in time is MTs for groundwater levels at the top of the screen. Our desire is to have water levels pretty high in the basin, so we're taking them up to the 2011 high. For storage, we're looking to cover whatever groundwater decline we had over a 5-year drought above the MT. Okay, and so we've got the MT set down here deep at the top of the screen, and we're looking for 5 years above that. So that's basically this distance right here above this well. If the desire is a 7-year drought, we can extend that by 2 more years. Subsidence, goes again 20 feet below to get to the historic level, and then another 20 feet for the MT. So what does that look like on a couple of typical wells? And I'm going to jump back to a couple of the diagrams that Patrick showed us earlier. And so here we have red line is the MT for groundwater level and groundwater storage. Again, the sort of teal colored dots are the actual water level measurements. Again, the black solid line there are the simulated water levels. Blue is the MO for groundwater level up here at the 2011 high or average value. Brown is the ground surface in this particular entrance. And so in this case, we would have a storage MO being somewhere down here, basically this distance from there to there, above the this distance from here to here, above the top of screen. If we look at the other well that he had there where water levels were just barely above the well screen, then we see a situation where the groundwater level and groundwater storage are there. The MO for groundwater level is very close. It's there. And you can't hardly see it, but the storage MO falls in right there almost at the groundwater level. So it sets you up for a situation where a vast majority of the time you're going to be satisfying your MO criteria, and for the vast majority of the wells, you're not likely to be exceeding your MT values for a significant amount of time per year either. So I'm going to quit there and give us an opportunity to go into some more questions. I realize that we've thrown a lot of information at folks tonight, and it may take you some time to ponder the information. We're prepared to try to address any questions or comments you have this evening, but please don't hesitate to reach out to us via the website. There's a contact us button on the agency's website. You can direct your questions to the agency, who will in turn forward them over to us for a response. And so you're welcome to provide input tonight or whenever you come up with questions, comments, or suggestions in the future. So thank you very much. And Lisa, are there anything in the chat room? Let's look here. What have we got?
We had a question about the modeling analysis. A request to know how well calibrated the model is for low surface water flow conditions, less than 25 cubic feet per second, and what the error of the analysis is given the very large grid spacing relative to the limited area scale of this type of analysis.
The surface water flow conditions that we're talking about there, using the relationship between flow and groundwater elevation in a key well, are actual physically measured. They're not modeled values. It's not relying on the model for that. I don't know if that helped answer the question.
Brian says it doesn't help answer the question. Is this something, I'm wondering if we want to try to get through getting the key input on each of these proposed SMCs, and if this is a more detailed question about the modeling analysis, we can do that through the other comments, or our next workshop, we'll discuss the model in detail, or if we have time at the end. Would that be okay?
Yeah, that's fine with me, yes.
Okay. So I don't know if we want to go back through. I'm sorry, Director Fadden.
Question to Chair Long, since this is a Board of Directors special meeting, are we going to have a chance for open discussion between the directors?
Yes, and so what I was raising my hand for is to have Tony pull up the draft SMC matrix. I think it's slide 2 or 4. I don't have them numbered on here.
Okay.
But that has all the draft matrix in which we're discussing. I think that's important for us all to have.
Okay.
As we're having these open discussion, because this is the first time the board has seen this matrix. It is a draft. I want to remind people that it is a draft. What we're here for is talking about the issues and getting an understanding of a field. This will be moving one way or another based on conversations that we're having. So input is very important. So I would like to open it up to the directors once we get that on the slide. First, to have some information before we go on to some more public comment questions. So with that, thank you, Tony, for bringing this up. And Director McFadden, you want to start off with any questions?
Sure. Well, several actually. And I guess I'm getting some feedback out here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
Just backing up to land subsidence. I'll kind of go through these one by one. I'm very hesitant to tie land subsidence with groundwater levels. Our basins have shown no or virtually no demonstrated subsidence. We're totally unlike the San Joaquin Valley, which has had up to 8.5 meters of subsidence in some of the worst areas. So I would prefer to use our unit of measurement as just actual subsidence, what we see, and maybe try to set limits there. But I don't think it's hard for me to see how setting an arbitrary groundwater level is going to really give us anything that we can use for subsidence. So I'll just I'll go through and make some comments.
Yeah, thank you.
Groundwater elevation. I have a concern. We've as you know, we've been through a lot of ad hoc committee meetings. We've talked about screen levels. I'm concerned that using screen levels, because of the huge variation in where screens start and end and just where the different wells are, that seems like it's going to be a fairly arbitrary number too. So I think we need to somehow figure out a water level that's reasonable. Part of the problem there too is if I look at the wells that I work with, there's a 30 to 40 foot difference in elevation and water levels between one end of the valley and another if you go north south, just because of the three-dimensionality of the basins and the water in the basins.
Sure.
So, we're going to have to be real careful and have some more board discussion there. Groundwater storage reduction. I always go back to we've been through the worst drought in recent history, 2011 to 2016, or however we want to define it. And as far as I know, we only had one well that was really detrimentally affected by it.
Correct.
People may have been pumping water level may have been gone through below the levels of screens. People may have dropped their bowls, but it worked. So I'm hesitant. I think we need to be very careful where we set our levels on that too. I'm not even sure we know what the level is where that would be of concern. I guess that's all for now. I'll let other people discuss, bring up their comments and discussions.
Along with what Ed is stating, I have the concern in regards to we were put at the GSA in this position because of the future, not because of what we've done in the past that was wrong or incorrect. But we were moved into a higher sensitivity on this because of the concern of if we get more population and we have more opportunity to change in the Santa Clara Valley. So I would agree with Ed that if we're at the drought of 2012-16, that to me seems like it's our worst case scenario. But we all survived. We all had our ag survive, environmental, all the things, they're still good in the fact that we're still thriving. Maybe it was a struggle then, but I'm thinking that that would be our baseline for the lowest. I'm not sure. I'm trying to understand. I know that there's many things that says you're going for your optimal water at this point right now, but I'm concerned where the levels are, how you're drawing those levels based on what the state demand is versus how we did. if I can make clear on that.
I see this. Kat, Selma, and Kat, you and I have talked, maybe we can talk about that more outside the meeting. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
All right, Director Kimball, do you have any questions, comments?
I do.
Okay.
I think Sigma was created because of the number of groundwater basins that were facing significant declines or obvious problems such as seawater intrusion. So a lot of the basins were, if you will, guilty. These two basins, from what I can see by the hydrographs, have been through a number of droughts. And when it rains, they always fill right back up. And so I think we're in a different situation in terms of how we meet the requirements of Sigma, because we're not in a situation where we're trying to fix a bad situation. We're in a situation where we're trying to understand how we can keep the basins in a state where they benefit the users. These basins and the water they contain are very valuable assets. Fresh water in Southern California will always be a precious asset. And I think it's our obligation to our stakeholders, that is to the people who live and work in these basins, to not unreasonably restrict their access to water. Or put another way, to understand how best to optimize the water that we have available in the basins that we have available, because they are deep, they recharge easily and readily. They are fed by very large watershed. So I'm not sure that historical droughts or historical information is more than an example of what has happened in the past. And I think we need to carefully look at what the potential are for the future. I think we do need to be careful about groundwater or about ground subsidence. We can choose the 1 foot that everybody else has chosen. We can base it on some spreadsheets that are very generalized. I think we ought to consider monitoring and responding to groundwater or surface changes, and maybe even in addition to INSAR, to putting in some GPS stations of our own that we can accurately monitor key locations. So instead of predicting, we can actually measure. I think and maybe it shows up in the fact that we accept that some wells go below the perforations or the screen, the water level goes below. I think we need to be careful because there's a whole range of wells. When we're talking about a problem with a well that's 90 feet deep, when today if you drill a well, you have to put a 50-foot sanitary seal in. So you're talking about a well that's a straw just barely into the top of the glass, or barely into the water in the glass. And I think, while it's an undesirable result that well goes dry, I don't think we should unreasonably restrict access to other 99% of the well water users in the basins. And I think we need to look at potentially providing funding to help people with very shallow wells, drill deeper wells that are more robust and allow them better access to the water. Because a 100-foot deep well is, and I spoke with a woman whose domestic well was 90 feet deep. That's not very deep. So I think we need to be really careful when we're setting these, that we don't unreasonably restrict the use of the basin. And that's all I had. Thank you.
Okay, Director Pace.
Yeah, I have a couple of notes that I kind of been making and stuff. Hopefully will kind of make some sense. Now that we have the model, I assume one of the things we've been waiting for is to have this model. Now that we'll have it and be able to get start running some models, start seeing some things, it seems like that would be helpful if we could run something, maybe find what we think will be the next drought, whether it'll be the 5-year, the 7-year was mentioned, whether it's longer based on historical records. But it would be nice to have something that we can run this model and then see what we're going to get kind of results there. It seems like we need to have some really data-driven decisions. And that's kind of my point on several of these things, like land subsidence or the surface water depletion. Without knowing the information, it's hard for me to make a good decision or to know what's the right decision to make. So it seems like it would be helpful to see, like right now, we have some historical information, but a question for me is, can we run a model and see how far the basin can be drawn down and would refill in the next wet cycle? If I knew what that distance was, it would help me understand, okay, yeah, we don't want to go below this certain level, but if this thing could be drawn down more, deeper than the 40 feet, maybe it's 50 feet, maybe it's 100 feet and still refill, that's just one data point. And I'm not suggesting I would want to go down that far, but it would help me understand as we make the decisions with everything else, what the capacity of the system is. Because seems to me we would want to be able to refill each wet cycle, but I don't know how far we can go down and before we aren't refilling. So now that we have the model, which you haven't had up to this point, Tony, it would be great to have that kind of stuff so we can make some of these decisions. What are significant impacts, right? So that I see something like that, and something along the lines too is having some discussions earlier today, trying to understand, is it 1 foot, 2 foot? What's a reasonable land subsidence, historical things of that nature? I'm looking at my well logs in Piru, and I'm still kind of under the impression that we're not likely going to have subsidence where I'm at. But at the same time, need to have something that goes through the whole system. So is there a way of saying something more along the lines of, instead of setting an exact number, or maybe we have to set a number, maybe make it a little larger, maybe it's 2 feet or something now, but that we put a plan in kind of in motion that says we're going to be evaluating these, and then as the data comes, we'll react according to the data. And right now we will do, it kind of has some trigger points perhaps, but that we're not setting that it's a definitive now. We're kind of saying we don't have the answers, but over the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to be looking for these answers as we go, but not restrict ourselves, as was mentioned earlier, too early. And then like for surface water depletion, I imagine this might be a sensitive topic for a lot of people. Some might consider some heartless when it comes to environmental things. I hope that's not the case for anyone. But what I really don't know is I don't know what are all the beneficial uses for groundwater dependent ecosystems. If that's one of our measuring sticks, is it plants only? Are there animals, fish, or whatever participating in this? It would be nice to have some data from, and not just anecdotal, but some data to see so we could make a decision. What are the really going to be impacts? Knowing what, with data, knowing what the impacts are, then it would make it easier for me to be able to say, yes, that's significant and a negative impact, or it's not. It may be not what's desirable, but it's not as significant, weighing in all the other data that we're looking at. And I just don't know without that data, because I just don't have the experience with it. And so I just feel like there would be a lot of information that we'd like to have the data. That being said, I also recognize the time frame is not going to allow us to make this a science project. We're not going to be able to go forever. And so I'm wondering, with the time we have, if we need to make any adjustments on our schedule of when we're going to complete these things, can we do something a little different and maybe set some of these guidelines, maybe push back our administrative draft a little bit, work on these key points, get some of this information, but with the concept of, as we get some more data, we're going to set a plan that we can adjust as we move forward, without getting too many restrictions that are going to tie our hands later that we may regret. And I know we'll probably have to get into that and talk more in depth, but that was just some concerns that might be applicable as we move forward. All of this information is helping me learn more, but it feels like there's still some more I don't know about what those impacts are technically to be able to make that decision. So those are some of the thoughts that I've had.
Thank you.
And that was good. Tim, Director Holgren, do you have any comments, questions?
No, none at this time.
Okay. I just wanted to circle back. I do like seeing where the max and min of our basins are. I think that's really important with the modeling. I have concern in regards to the wells of the screens, because if someone put one lower or higher, depending on the cost, or trying to make it equal for everybody, I think is really important. And so I'm concerned on using the screen walls as what it determines the level. As far as land subsidence, I don't believe we've ever had land subsidence here because of our geography. And so I do have concerns on this level. And is this something that we can put, we do not have this, but this is on watch? Or do we have to actually put an actual number to it? That's a question I have. On the GDEs, in the studies that, or the classes that I've been in with the GRAs and so forth, they talk about the ecosystem that's dependent on the water, such as roots for the golden oak and other plants associated, and that they had to be 30 feet deep or so. And so that's a question on what GDEs we are in need to make sure we watch out for, that are at risk, or which ones just ebb and flow of the water being there and they're okay. I do think we should watch that, but that it's how Sigma has been written as to water levels and how we accommodate the GDEs. So I just want to make sure that we do talk about that a little bit, because we do have our environmental and our agriculture here and our MOIs, and we need to make sure that we're doing what we were told to do for Sigma in the state. I think that's important. Seawater intrusion is not applicable. So that's why I'm wondering if land subsidence, is that not applicable, or could it really happen? Because we just have never had that in the basin. So I'm just concerned putting a level there when we don't need it. And then water degrading, we have chlorides that are coming in from the basin before us in Santa Clarita, but what else do we need to do there? I'm just questioning that one. How do we monitor it? Because I don't see any figures or extremes. Is that just based on the state highs and lows, what they're requiring? I just need more information on that. And I think those are my questions at this time. I'd like to, Tony, do you have any questions for our directors as to comments, questions?
This has all been really good feedback. This is exactly the kinds of discussions we wanted to have, is to drill into what you're thinking about the straw man that we threw up today, threw up on the screen today. And we'll have to come back to some of the directors with some thoughts on trying to clarify exactly what they would mean by something. So if they're saying, we'd like to have more information on item X, well, what would you like to see? And then we get to see if we actually have that information to share with you. One thing I do want to remind all the directors that this analysis has been based on our historical data sets that we have right now. And we're going to be developing the future conditions data sets. That was the comment early on. And so we need to get that information compiled so that we can add it to the groundwater model. So we're going to put in land use changes in pumping, all that kinds of stuff will go into the groundwater flow model, and then we'll run it out into the future, and we'll see what happens to groundwater elevations, et cetera, surface water flows, the whole 9 yards. We'll see what those water level elevations look like. And if at that point we need to adjust MTs or whatever, we'll now be forearmed with information from the forward scenarios, and how we best set that up. But tonight was basically trying to get the concepts in front of you and let you chew on that a little bit and see those which give you heartburn or those of which you think, yeah, that's okay. That was the whole purpose of having the straw man tonight. So thank you for responding with comments. They were helpful.
I appreciate that. Now, for everyone who's on tonight, I want to make sure this will be available on our website, and it's a draft. So this is not mandated. This is not what we're pushing out. This is for discussion only. I want to make sure that's the case. And I would like to open it up for public comments on this item. This, just to make sure, if you want to put your question in the chat, this is also to understand the needs of our community. We have had several people make comments throughout this presentation, but if there was anything else, I wanted to open up if there was a hand or a comment. And also, based on what Tony was stating, also, you can always go to our website for a comment and submit more. Because I think this is, like you're saying, is that we have to think about this, let it digest, come back, and keep this process. Even if we put it into a plan, that process will always be updated. One thing is, this is a living document that will always be changed. So with that, I'll open it to anyone for any comments.
Sure, Long. I have one additional comment or two.
Please go ahead.
I think that the ad hoc committee gave us good foundation, gave us a chance to really vet some ideas. I would suggest in the future that this is probably going to be one of the most critical tasks that this board takes on through this whole process. And I think that going forward, it might be better to have the board meet as a whole board for further definition of our SMC matrix, even if it means an extra meeting or two within the tight time frame that we have. So I think it's very valuable to have everyone here. I'm sorry Candace isn't here. I'm sure she'll be participating in the future. We need her input too. But I think we need to go forward as a whole board on this.
Thank you. I appreciate all the work that the ad hoc committee has put on this. It's hard work. They don't give you this. They just say, here, what's your best guess? And we as a community and stakeholders actually have to decide this together. So I appreciate that.
I would also encourage stakeholders, both here and who are not participating, to send in comments. It's very important.
Yes, I do not see anyone else that has raised hands. And I would like to ask, for expectation purposes, Tony, when will the next time this comes back to us?
So we do have one comment, one raised hand.
Oh, good. Please go ahead. Who is it?
Oh, I saw Brian's hand up. Brian Bundy, or did it go
Okay.
down?
Go ahead, Brian.
I was clicking it on and off. I couldn't figure out what I was doing.
Okay.
I
Good
couldn't figure
evening.
if my hand was up or down, Brian, so I'm with you on this.
Yeah, well, it helps when you scroll to see yourself, to see if your hand's up. But that's my failure. Thank you, Chair Long. I just looking at the schedule, it seems, in listening to the conversation, it seems pretty apparent to me that these topics are going to take some more time to for your board to, deliberately consider these issues and make good policy decisions. So I would suggest that the board consider looking at the schedule and perhaps thinking about whether there really is a need for an administrative draft GSP. It seems to me to be more efficient to take time to do good, go through and do the best planning we can before putting pen to paper, at least on these portions of the GSP, and that it may be more efficient and less controversial to take that time to work through the issues and then just have a single draft later in the process. So I would encourage you to think about that. That would create some time and space for the conversations that I think you're going to find you need to have. And in general, I'm also just wondering about the admin draft altogether, what that would be. And I think at the last board meeting, Tony mentioned that would be internal review by the board. I'm not sure how that would work. If the board has it, it has to also be released to the public. But anyways, the main point is just creating space to do the planning. And then if you do a good job on that, then the draft will have less comments and be easier to finalize. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you for your comments on that. Appreciate it. Is there anyone else?
Chair Long,
Yes.
if I could, Tony, could you flip back to the schedule on the screen? Because I also have concerns about the administrative draft. I remember when we discussed it, and I thought that legal counsel gave us the opinion that that administrative draft is a public, once it comes to the board under the Brown Act, it's a public document. So it's essentially like we're releasing it once, reviewing it, and then releasing it again and reviewing it. I have concerns as we look at this, that a lot of the technical memos that I think I want to read before I really make my comments on the SMCs are being released between now and January.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I'd like to see the technical memo on SMCs and the work on SMCs continue over December and January, even into February. And then when I look at the schedule, I really raise the question, like Brian, that are we making the best use of time by having an administrative draft and having our consultant prepare that? Or will we be better off using it to work on these SMCs, get stakeholder buy-in? And also, as I think about the SMCs, I think we've already, in a way, identified what might be two projects or management actions. The first one being addressing or helping to address the very shallow wells. The second one is if the water levels in the basins drop such that the surface water and the subsurface water that's available to the GDEs is no longer available, is there a project as simple as a well in that area that could draw water and provide it in those periods where the basin water levels are not providing enough water to rising groundwater in those areas to support those GDEs? So I'd like to see us have a little more time here. And it seems to me that in a way, we're already working with the public. We've already released, in a way, some concepts and parts of the GSP or technical memos, which are available on our website, all hundreds of pages. I think we ought to really seriously consider, and maybe it should be a future a board agenda item, to consider removing the administrative draft and working until the public review draft. So those are my comments. Thank you, Chair.
Director Kimball, Chair Long, if I can respond to that one. We don't have legal counsel here tonight, but Director Kimball's correct that technically a draft that's made available to all the board members is a public document. So, you know, in the strictest sense of the word, an administrative draft is one that is sort of circulated among staff and the staff team for internal comments. So I think it does make sense when you have a draft of the document that you have folks like Dan Detmer or Jason Sun or others that would provide you know, quality control review and useful comments to the author. But it is absolutely true that as soon as we put a draft out for the board review, it really is a public document. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there might be some crazy way that you could, you know, bend the rules or whatever to do that, but is it really helpful? And I think I'm glad that the conversation went this way, because this was a question I was going to ask is it better? It seems like it would be better to put the effort into trying to get out the technical memos, continue this substantive discussion, and then leave the admin draft for a true admin draft, and then, you know, have as much of this discussion in public as we can. And then, you know, not having to have a dual step on that. So I think the board can think about that, but thank you.
Thank you. And Tony, I would like to ask, just because we're doing the technical items, we're still being able to work on the draft. Am I correct? I mean, there are certain things like the history of our basin and all that kind of stuff. You guys can still work on the body of it. But what we're doing is going to then plug in all the technical items. Is that correct?
Yeah, those kinds of items can continue on. The general things. This has no impact on this discussion tonight, has no impact on those kinds of things. However, what we talked about tonight is the meat of the document. And changes that we make to a criteria this way or that way ripple throughout the document. And so this is what I was warning the board about months ago, that the really hard stuff is coming. Well, it's here. This is the hard stuff.
Right. And we appreciate that. And I think we are all in on it from what I'm hearing tonight. And agreed. I believe that everyone is agreeing with Director McFadden of the fact that this as a board and with our stakeholders, we need to be talking, and this is top of mind. So the question is when can this come back to the board so we can have another discussion on it? And then I also asked the stakeholders that are here tonight to tell their friends and tell their stakeholder buddies that this is really important, and we need everyone's buy-in and conversation on this. It's extremely important, and we need to make these decisions to hit the deadlines. So yeah, so we might have to push out the admin draft. You might be starting it, but there's a lot of information that we still have to do.
Right.
Okay.
Chair Long,
yes.
I'd just like to say that I'd support Director Kimball's suggestion. I'm just saying this in a little fancier way, what you just said. So the suggestion to direct staff and our consultant to look at the GSP timeline that we're looking at on our screen now and adjust it to give us more time to look at the SMCs and continue this discussion until we refine this in a way that is satisfactory and we can use in the GSP. So I don't know if we need a motion. I think everybody understands that, but
That's good. And then
got it.
also, just for the record, we have the letter dated October 13th from the Fillmore Basin Pumpers Association and Piru Basin Pumpers Association, addressing the SMC development process, and then also questions that they had. Wanted to make sure that was on the record. Is there any other public comments or any other comments from the board at this time? Then the motion, as Ed stated, so this is a receive and file, and then what Ed said.
not a motion, not a motion, just a direction
Yeah.
from the board staff, to staff and our consultants.
Right. All right, because this is a motioned item, so that's what we would be doing. So
Well,
that's the first with Ed. And can I get a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. Director Kimball has seconded. And then any further discussion? Eva, if you have it, can you do a roll call, please?
Yes.
Thank
Director
you.
Holmgren,
Yes.
Director Kimball,
Yes.
Chair Long,
Yes.
Vice Chair McFadden,
Aye.
Director Pace.
Yes.
Perfect.
All right, that motion is approved unanimously. Thank you again for everyone's feedback. You still have time to provide more feedback. And our next board meeting that I know you don't want to miss is November 19th at 5 o'clock. So thank you everyone for your information and your input, and I appreciate everybody's time. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Tony, we'll be getting back to you and tell you exactly what's going to happen as far as ag water use is for the next 50 years.
Okay. I look forward to seeing how that crystal ball works, because I need one too. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Yeah, let's see.